They went below the earth in search of coal, but never returned. In the black caverns of Raven Hollow, men whispered prayers that echoed back in voices not their own, and when the lanterns went dark, the mine sealed itself around the living. The camera lingers on a valley wrapped in mist, a town small enough to vanish in a map-maker's error. Wooden roofs lean against one another like exhausted shoulders. Smoke curls upward from stone chimneys, carried east by winds that taste of coal and salt. At its heart is the mine, Raven Hollow, a mouth cut into the earth, braced with timber beams, blackened by years of soot. Men enter it by lantern light, and each evening, when the sun sinks behind the ridges, the shaft exhales a breath that is not wind, low, heavy, as though the earth itself were whispering. The miners call it the Hollow's hymn, a sound too deep to belong to any man, too steady to be the shifting of stone. But the work does not stop. Raven Hollow was a town built on scarcity, no fertile fields, no rivers for trade, only a seam of coal, black and glistening, carved into the mountain's belly. Families lived in rows of company houses, identical as teeth, narrow windows, splintered steps, walls so thin you could hear your neighbor cough. Children wore shoes patched with cloth. Women boiled bones twice over for broth, and men descended into the dark 6 days a week, with rosaries tucked into their pockets. The mine gave them life, and it demanded it back, piece by piece. At dawn, the men gathered outside the shaft, faces gray with dust, even before the day began. Lanterns in hand, helmets dented by years of use, their mouths moved silently, whispering a prayer that had no beginning and no end. A prayer not of hope, but of endurance. The company foreman stood watch. His coat was long, his pocket watch gleamed. He never stepped inside, and when the horn sounded, the men entered one by one, swallowed by the dark. In the evenings, the town waited. Children played along the fence posts, counting each man who emerged. Mothers lit lamps in windows to guide them home, and the church bell rang at 6, announcing the safe return of fathers and brothers. But sometimes the count was off. A man would emerge with his arm bound in cloth, burned where the gas caught, or another would stumble out with his ears ringing, whispering that he heard something in the tunnels, something that moved when the lanterns went dark. The company always had an explanation: gas pockets, stone shifts, fatigue. The priest urged faith, the foreman urged silence, and the town kept breathing. The winds at night were different. When the last lanterns were out, and the families huddled in their wooden homes, the shaft sang, low, drawn out, like a hymn sung from behind the walls of the earth. Some said it was the mountain settling, others claimed it was air being forced through the tunnels. But children who pressed their ears to the floorboards swore they could hear voices, not words, but prayers, and sometimes their fathers' names. One winter evening, a boy named Daniel awoke to the sound. He was 8 years old, the son of a miner whose boots stood by the door, caked with mud. The wind rose outside, shaking the shutters, and beneath it, he heard the shaft, a hum, steady as a heartbeat. Daniel pressed his ear to the wall, and he heard his father's voice, not calling, not crying, just whispering, as though finishing a prayer. But his father was there, asleep in the next room, breathing heavy from a day in the dark. Daniel never told him. The town's church was small, whitewashed walls, a single bell. Inside, the crucifix leaned forward, wood cracked by damp. The priest, Father Callahan, preached restraint, that the mine was a trial, a place where faith was tested, not broken, that suffering was sanctified. But even he paused, each time the shaft exhaled at dusk. His prayers ended too quickly. His eyes strayed toward the ridge, and when the bells rang at night without his hand, his lips trembled, Not all believed the hollow was cursed. For some, the mine was a bargain. You give your breath, one man said, and the hollow gives you bread. Coal fueled the fires. Coal bought the salt. Coal sent letters out of the valley. And yet, in every home, there were stories of boots left muddy at the doorstep for weeks after a man had gone missing, of wives who heard their husbands' laughter long after the funerals, of shadows that lingered in the doorways, too tall for the frames. But something wasn't right. The accidents began to multiply. A beam gave way where no rot was found. Gas seeped where no vent was marked. And always, the sound, the hollow's hymn, echoing in the night. Sometimes faint, like a lullaby. Sometimes sharp, like a choir cut short. The miners heard it most of all. In the tunnels, when their lamps burned low, the sound was closer there. Behind the walls, above the ceilings, as though the stone itself remembered voices, and could not stop repeating them. A man named Joseph Corney kept a small journal. Each day he wrote only one line. Most days it was numbers, the count of wagons, the weight of coal, but sometimes there were words. Heard it again. Not wind. Prayers followed us to the surface. The hollow watches when we kneel. No one saw the journal until after. By then, Joseph was gone. The children of Raven Hollow grew up, knowing three things: that the mine was their future, that prayer was their shield, and that the hollow was always listening. When they played in the fields, they dared one another to shout into the shaft. Their voices came back broken, bent by the tunnels, not echoes, but answers. One boy swore he heard his own name, whispered back in a tone that was not his. The others laughed, but none ever did it again. The miners themselves avoided the subject. They worked, they prayed, they ate, and when the lanterns sputtered in the tunnels, they sang hymns, old Irish melodies carried from their fathers, songs meant to keep the dark at bay. But the dark listened, and sometimes it sang back. The women of the town kept watch in their own way. They hung rosaries on door frames, lit candles along the ridge, and listened for the wind. Some swore they could tell when an accident would come. The shaft's breath grew heavier, the prayers louder, and the earth itself seemed restless, shifting beneath their feet. But no warning ever stopped the men from going below. Raven Hollow was a town balanced on silence, the silence of the company, who denied the accidents, the silence of the church, who cautioned against superstition, the silence of the miners, who knew too well what they had heard. But silence is not peace. Silence is pressure. It builds, and the hollow waited. On a spring morning, the foreman gathered 11 men. The seam was deep, he said. A new tunnel had been marked. They were to go below at dusk, lanterns ready, prayers steady. No one spoke against it. No one refused. For in Raven Hollow work was not a choice. It was survival. The sun dipped low behind the ridges. The church bell rang 6, and the hollow breathed. The men stood at the mouth of the shaft, their wives beside them, their children holding fast to sleeves, lanterns lit, rosaries clutched, faces pale in the fading light. One by one they stepped inside. Their boots struck stone, their voices fell to whispers, and the mine closed around them. Above, the wind carried their prayers upward, through the timbers, across the town, into the church where Father Callahan waited. And as the last man entered, the shaft exhaled, a sound low, unbroken, endless. The hollow was listening, and it would not give them back. The ridge fades into dusk, the valley grows still, and all that remains is the mine. Its mouth yawns wide, a black wound in the earth, framed by beams of timber that creak as the wind presses through. The air carries a weight, dust, damp, and something sweeter, a smell not of coal, but of incense, clinging faintly to the night. The men gather there, 11 in number, their faces gaunt from years below ground, their eyes reflecting lantern light. Steady, but dim, they stand in silence,
waiting for the horn, the sound that calls them down, a sound that marks their absence before it begins. The town watches. Children cling to their mothers' skirts. Boots scuff against the packed dirt road. The church bell is silent, though its rope sways gently in the evening air. One wife crosses herself 3 times. Another whispers a prayer in Irish, words too soft for the foreman to hear, for prayers are not allowed at the shaft, only work. The foreman checks his watch. His voice is sharp. The men obey. Lanterns are lit, rosaries tucked deep in pockets, and step by step they enter. The shaft swallows them whole, the glow of 11 flames drifting downward into the earth, each flicker bending against the stone as the walls close in. Boots strike timber, iron rails sing faintly beneath the carts, and the air changes. Above ground it was cool, below it is damp, and strangely sweet. The smell grows thicker, not of coal, not of dust, but of incense. Like a church in mourning, they descend deeper. The lanterns sway, shadows stretch long and broken across the beams. One man mutters that the tunnels feel warmer tonight. Another agrees. The stone sweats, the walls breathe, and still they go on, for there is no choice. The company demands coal, the town demands bread, and the hollow demands silence. Hours pass. Above the town sleeps, windows shuttered, candles out, but some wake. Children who dream of footsteps on the floor, women who smell incense on the wind. The church bell rings once. No hand pulls the rope, and the sound carries down the ridge, settling over the mine like a shroud. In the tunnels the men strike stone. Pickaxes echo sharp against the walls. Coal breaks free. Lanterns sputter. But something isn't right. The air should taste of dust. It does not. The air should echo with stone. It does not. Instead the sound is muted, as if every noise is swallowed, as if the mine itself is listening. One man pauses. He swears he hears a voice behind him, low, steady, praying. But when he turns, the others are silent.
Their faces pale in the lantern light, their lips still, and yet the voice continues. The men press on, each step heavier than the last, each breath thick with the scent of burning resin. A lantern flickers, the flame bends sideways, though there is no draft. The man holding it curses softly. The others stop. For a moment, the mine is quiet. Only their breathing, only the faint drip of watered down stone. And then, a sound. Not a collapse, not a cart, but something deeper, like a bell struck far below. The stone vibrates beneath their boots. The lanterns quiver, and the men say nothing. Above ground, the foreman waits at his post. He paces, he smokes, and when the wind shifts, he smells it too. Incense. He spits on the ground, mutters a curse, and walks away. The mine breathes behind him, a long, steady exhale. Days pass. The sun rises. The sun sets, but no man returns. At first, the wives wait patiently. Children count the hours. The church bell rings at 6, but no footsteps climb the ridge. By the second night, the lanterns are found, not carried in hands, not hanging from hooks, but scattered just inside the shaft. 11 in number, each extinguished, still warm to the touch, set, as though blown out only moments before. To the rescue team hesitates. They step into the shaft, with ropes tied to their waists. They carry fresh lanterns. They descend, but the air is thick, the incense heavier, so the ropes pull tight, and one by one, the rescuers retreat, their faces white, to their lips refusing speech. When asked what they saw, they shake their heads. When pressed, one mutters only. The walls moved. No bodies are found. No tools. No blood. Only silence. The company posts a notice. The words are short. Accident. No survivors. The church tolls its bell 11 times. Father Callahan lowers his head in prayer, and yet the incense lingers. It drifts through the homes. It clings to the windows. It stains the night air, as if the mine itself were a cathedral, and the men its offering. But something wasn't right. For nights after, those who passed the ridge swore they saw light, a faint glow, far down the shaft. Not fire, not flame, but a lantern, still burning. And though the shaft was empty, and though the lanterns had been found, the smell of incense never left. It rose with the wind. It seeped into the town, and it clung to the prayers of the living. Raven Hollow was silent. The wives wore black. The children waited for fathers who never came. And the mine stood open, breathing, waiting. The lanterns were placed in the church. 11 flames rayed it, but their light was weak. Their glass smudged with something black, like ash pressed by a hand that had not let go. The people prayed, but the prayers did not lift. They sank into the floorboards, into the stone, back into the hollow. And on the third night, a boy swore he heard his father's voice, calling from beneath the earth, not crying, not begging, just praying, as though the work continued, as though the 11 had never left the shaft at all. The boy told no one, but he never went near the ridge again. The hollow had taken its due. 11 men, 11 prayers, 11 flames snuffed out, and the town knew the truth. The mine was not just a place of work, it was a mouth that fed on breath, a cathedral without altar, a hymn without end, and it had only begun to sing. The mouth of the mine stood silent. In the early dawn, a black wound carved into the side of the hill. Mist clung low across the grass, drifting slowly, as if unwilling to approach the entrance. Lantern light wavered against the fog, small halos of gold struggling against the pale gray morning. Women stood in clusters, shawls pulled tight around their shoulders. Children clung to skirts, eyes fixed on the dark opening where their fathers had gone. The air was damp, heavy with waiting. It had been hours since the night shift was due to emerge. Too many hours. At first there was no fear. The men were miners. Delays happened. Carts overturned. Lamps went out. Tunnels collapsed and needed clearing. These were risks built into the rhythm of their lives. But as the sun crept higher, unease sharpened, because not one voice had risen from the shaft, not one echo of tools, not a single sound, and that silence pressed against the villagers' chests like a weight. By midday, the line of waiting wives had grown longer. More children arrived. More faces peered into the opening, listening for the familiar clatter that never came. The foreman paced near the beams that held the mouth of the mine, running his hand along the damp timber, whispering under his breath. Finally, he gave the order. A rescue team would go down. 5 men stepped forward, volunteers. Though the word did little to mask the truth, they were chosen because they were strong enough, calm enough, and perhaps desperate enough not to refuse. They strapped on their helmets, checked their lanterns, and tied lengths of rope around their waists, thick hemp, coiled and heavy, so that if anything went wrong, they could be pulled back. The women watched in silence as the first rescuer crossed into the shaft. His light bobbed once, then was swallowed whole. One by one, the others followed. The ropes hissed across the ground, dragged into the dark. The villagers waited. Minutes stretched into a half hour, then longer. The ropes shifted slightly, tugged by unseen movements far below. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Children hid their faces against their mothers' skirts. At last, a figure appeared. The first rescuer stumbled into the light of the morning. His helmet was crooked, lantern extinguished, rope dragging limply at his side. His face was pale, streaked with sweat, though the air was cool. His lips moved,
but no sound came. Behind him, another man emerged, then another. All 5 returned, but something wasn't right. Their bodies were intact. Their clothes bore no marks of fire, no stains of earth or blood. Yet their eyes, those hollow, trembling eyes, looked as if they had seen something that stripped the color from the world. The foreman rushed forward. He asked what they had found, if the men were alive, if a collapse had trapped them deeper in the shaft. But the rescuers did not answer. They stood in a line, trembling, their lanterns dangling lifeless in their hands. Each shook his head slightly, as though language itself had abandoned them. Finally, one whispered a single phrase. The tunnels moved. The villagers stirred. Some murmured prayers. Others pulled their children close. The foreman demanded clarity, asked if the tunnels had collapsed, if the beams had given way, if smoke had clouded their path. But the rescuers only repeated it. The tunnels moved. Their voices cracked with each word, as though speaking them caused pain. And then they fell silent. Days later, when pressed again, none would elaborate. None would write down what they had seen. None would speak of what had happened in the dark. They lived in town still, their hands uninjured, their lungs clear, but they no longer entered the shaft. They no longer spoke of mining. Some no longer spoke at all. The wives of the 11 waited still. They returned each morning to the mouth of the mine, lanterns in hand, shawls pulled against the chill. Children asked where their fathers had gone, and the silence of their mothers was the only reply. The rescuers avoided them. Their footsteps quickened when they passed the waiting women. They averted their eyes, ashamed, but something else lingered in their expressions, something closer to fear. Because whatever they had seen in the mine was not only unspeakable, it was unshakable. And each night, as they lay in their beds, they closed their eyes only to see tunnels shifting, stone walls breathing, and a darkness that did not stay still. The 11 men never returned. The mine itself remained unchanged. Its timbers held, its paths stretched deep into the earth. By daylight, it was no different than it had ever been, but no one volunteered to go inside again. Not after the tunnels moved, and not after the rescuers lost their voices to something they could not name. Because once a man enters a place where the earth itself will not stay still, he never truly returns. Understood. Here is chapter 4. Echoes in the Stone expanded to roughly 6,000 words in the calm documentary, religious horror voice you specified.
Family carried its own private burden into the air. The stone arches above caught the voices, twisting them into echoes that folded back down upon the people, as if the church itself prayed with them, though not in words they recognized. The hymn rose, then faltered, then rose again, but something wasn't right. The children shifted in the pews, restless, tugging at sleeves, whispering words too faint for their mothers to hush. They stared at the dark beams overhead, at the empty space where the ropes hung for the bells, at the floor beneath their feet, as though it hid something. The women gripped their rosaries tighter. A boy no older than 7 kept his eyes fixed on the door, lips moving soundlessly, mouthing a name again and again, his father's name. The priest closed the book. His sermon was brief. He spoke of perseverance, of God's silence as a test. He urged them to believe that absence was not abandonment. His voice cracked once, then steadied, though his throat worked as if every swallow tasted of ash. The last hymn ended, and then nothing. The silence that followed pressed hard against the ear, louder than any prayer. It spread like smoke, seeping into the corners, settling over the bowed heads. No one moved. No one wished to be the first to rise, to break the spell of waiting. A woman at the back pulled her child close, rocking slightly, her lips pressed into the crown of his head. The boy clutched a wooden toy soldier in his fist, the paint worn smooth. He did not look at her. He stared down at the floor. Another mother wiped her hands across her skirts again and again, though they were already dry. Her daughter's braids were damp with sweat where she pressed her cheek against her mother's arm. The priest turned, extinguishing one of the altar candles, though the flame sputtered back to life. After his hand withdrew, his eyes narrowed, his lips tightened. He said nothing. The night outside was still, heavy, the stars smothered by low clouds, and then the bells began to ring, a single toll, rolling across the valley like thunder, then another, then a cascade, the tones falling over one another in quick succession, iron striking iron with impossible force. But the ropes hung motionless. The tower was empty. The sound was relentless. It poured from the steeple, as though the very stones had become hollow, resonant, alive. Windows rattled in their frames. Dust shook from the rafters. Children screamed, clutching their mothers, their cries swallowed by the storm of noise. The priest stumbled back, nearly dropping his book. He rushed to the door, craning his neck toward the tower. His lips moved in prayer, but his eyes, wide, unblinking, betrayed something far more fragile. The bells swung on their own. Some swore the tones were uneven, that there was more than one rhythm, clashing in the air, layered like voices speaking over one another, pulling in opposite directions. And then the children began to whisper. They said they heard their fathers, not in the bells above, not in the air outside, but beneath the floor. Their small voices carried in the breaks between tolls, thin but insistent. They pointed to the boards beneath their feet. They said their fathers were calling, not shouting, not weeping, calling, soft, familiar, the same cadence that had once carried bedtime stories, or comforted them after nightmares. The voices of men they knew, men they missed, men who had not returned. But now those voices came from the ground. One boy slipped from his mother's grasp. One boy slipped from his mother's grasp. He pressed his ear flat to the planks, ignoring her cries to rise. He listened, his chest heaving, lips trembling, and then he whispered, "He wants me to come down." The mothers yanked their children back, clutching them so tightly. The little ones cried out. They rocked them, murmuring prayers half remembered, prayers learned at their own mother's knees. The priest shouted for silence, but his voice broke under the weight of the bells. His words scattered, inaudible, drowned by the metallic roar. The tolling did not cease until midnight, and outside, dogs gathered. No one summoned them, no one fed them, yet they came, padding out of the dark lanes, thin shapes with ribs sharp against their hides. They circled the mine mouth, their paws sinking into damp soil. Their bodies trembled, hackles raised, eyes fixed on the black shaft. They howled, not sharp barks, not hungry yelps, but long, low calls, like mourning, one after another. Their cries joined, layering into a sound that seemed to sink rather than rise, pouring into the earth, as if calling down to something below. But not one dared step closer. The strongest turned away, snapping at their own tails, whining as though in pain. The weakest collapsed where they stood, sides heaving, throats raw. By morning, the bells had stopped. The tower stood still, the ropes swaying gently, though no wind blew. Inside the church, the floor was marked, small scratches, as if tiny fingers had clawed the wood. The children would not speak of what they heard. Their mothers refused to ask, but something lingered in the air of Raven Hollow, heavy as coal dust, because once you have heard your father's voice calling from beneath the floor, you never trust silence again. The forest at the edge of Raven Hollow was never silent. Even in the stillness of night,
It carried its own language. Wind through branches, the distant rush of water, the restless shuffle of animals no one could see. On this night, the trees stood stark against a pale sky, their bare limbs clawing upward, as though they had been burned long ago and never recovered. The ground was wet, soft with autumn decay, and the fog pressed low enough that each step seemed to vanish into smoke. A boy lingered at the tree line. He was no older than 10. His coat hung too loose on his shoulders, his boots scuffed down to the leather. He should not have been there. The curfew bells had long since rung, and every house in town was shuttered, every lamp extinguished. But his eyes were fixed on the shadows. His breath came in short, unsteady bursts, because he had seen something move. At first he thought it was a trick of the mist, a shift of branch, a passing of cloud. But then the shape separated itself from the trees, standing still, upright, unmistakably human. The boy's lips parted, though no sound escaped. His hands dug into the bark of the nearest tree, splinters biting his palms. The figure did not move closer, did not raise its hand or step forward. It only stood, half concealed in fog, as though undecided whether it belonged to this world at all. And then the boy saw its face, ashen, colorless, the skin stretched tight across bone, like something starved beyond life itself. The eyes were worse. They glowed faintly, not with light, but with a heat that shimmered deep within, a smoldering, coal-like burn that pulsed low and steady, as if some furnace lived behind them. The boy tried to call out, his throat closed, his chest locked, and then the figure turned, not toward him, not away, but slowly, as though caught by a tether, its movements deliberate, its body heavy with some unseen weight. It began to walk. The boy staggered backward, his boots slipping in mud. He did not chase, did not dare follow. He only watched as the figure passed from the edge of the woods, drifting across the slope, toward the valley that held the mine, toward the shaft. By morning, the boy spoke. He told his mother, he told the priest. By midday, he told the whole town. Some laughed at him, said he had dreamed it, that he had been frightened by the shadows, by the fog, by the stories whispered too often in the dark. But others did not laugh, because the boy spoke with no flourish, no exaggeration. He said only what he saw, and nothing more.
Not of fire, not of ash, but of incense. And once a scent like that rises from the ground, it does not fade. It clings, it lingers, it makes even the most faithful begin to wonder, because when you follow prints that lead only to the dark, you never expect them to walk back out. The frame begins in silence, a slow, lingering shot. The abandoned mine mouth, its timbers sagging, its edges crumbling in rust and stone. Wind moves across the hill, carrying with it the faintest smell of soot, and somewhere far below the surface, where no light reaches, there is still water dripping against stone, a sound that never stops. The villagers had gathered here before. They had prayed, they had searched, they had waited for signs. But on this morning, it was different, because Father Callahan had decided he would go inside himself. The priest stood at the edge of the shaft, holding a wooden crucifix in one hand and his Bible in the other. His eyes were bloodshot from nights without sleep. His hands trembled, but his posture did not falter. The crowd kept their distance. Farmers, widows, children who clutched their mothers' skirts and would not blink. Nobody spoke above a whisper, because everyone knew what it meant. If the priest was going in, then something unholy was believed to be waiting. The villagers watched as Callahan dipped his fingers into a small vial of water. He traced the sign of the cross across his own forehead, and then across the wooden beams that marked the entrance to the mine. But something wasn't right. The water hissed when it touched the timber, as if the old beams themselves rejected the blessing. A murmur moved through the crowd. Still, the priest did not hesitate. He adjusted the rosary at his belt, tied a length of cord around his waist, its other end held by two men at the surface, a safety line, a tether, and without another word he stepped into the dark. The villagers leaned forward, listening, straining for sound, the crunch of boots against gravel, the faint scrape of wood, the hollow echo as his figure vanished into the tunnel. Then silence, only the wind above, and the creak of rope as it slid slowly across the ground. Minutes passed. No one moved. Mothers kept their hands over children's mouths. Fathers tightened their grip on lantern handles. The priest had not taken a light. He had only his crucifix and his Bible. Inside, the air grew colder with each step. Callahan's breath lingered before him. In faint clouds, he could taste the metallic tang of iron, the stale heaviness of dust. The cord tugged gently at his waist, reminding him that he was not alone, that above him, somewhere, people waited. But the deeper he went, the weaker that thought became. The rope was slack now, too slack. He turned a corner, and the last trace of daylight vanished. The blackness pressed in from all sides. It was not merely dark, it was total. He whispered a verse aloud, steadying his voice. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. But something wasn't right. The air shifted, and in that shifting, he heard something. It was faint, at first, like a breeze caught in stone, then clearer, a note, a human note, singing. He froze. The mine was sealed. The men had been dead for weeks, but here, somewhere ahead, the air carried song, low, unbroken, a hymn. Callahan pressed forward, one step at a time, Bible tight in his grip. The melody grew, a chant, layered in voices that seemed both near and impossibly far away. He held up the crucifix, as if to cut through the dark, but the sound did not retreat. It welcomed him, and that's when he saw it. A scrap of paper, half buried in the gravel. He bent down, pulled it free. It was a page torn from a Bible, its edges blackened, the words smudged, as if touched by flame. Yet in the dimness, one verse remained clear. They shall call, but I will not answer. The priest's throat tightened. He whispered another prayer, but as he whispered, the voices answered him, singing louder, rising in the black. The hymn was one he knew, the miner's hymn, the one they sang before each descent, and it was still being sung now. He turned a corner. The sound rushed forward like air from a furnace, but there was no light, no figures, only pages, scattered across the ground, fluttering though no breeze touched them. Some burned at the edges, some soaked with dark stains, all torn from the same book. And in the silence between verses, he heard something else, breathing. It was not his own. He raised the crucifix high, whispering the words of deliverance. His voice cracked, his lips trembled, the breathing drew closer, and then all at once, it stopped. The hymn ended. The mine was silent. Callahan's pulse pounded in his ears. The rope at his waist pulled gently. Those above, checking, waiting. He wanted to answer, to tug back, to give them a sign, but he couldn't. His hands shook as he reached for another page. This one was blistered, its edges curling. He turned it over. The ink was warped, the letters unreadable. He dropped it. The sound it made on the ground was too loud, too final. He knew he had to leave. He began to walk back, faster now, clutching the crucifix so tightly.
the wood bit into his skin. The hymn did not resume. The breathing did not return. But the silence was worse. It followed him, pressed on him, watched him, every step, until at last he saw the faint gray of daylight ahead. The villagers gasped as his figure emerged from the shaft, his eyes downcast, his face pale. The men pulled at the cord, guiding him up the final steps. His boots dragged, his shoulders shook. In his hands he clutched torn pages blackened at the edges. The Bible itself was gone. He stumbled into the open air, where the crowd parted in fearful reverence. Children hid their faces. Women whispered prayers. The priest did not look at them. He sank to his knees in the dirt. His lips moved, but no sound came. For hours he said nothing. No one dared touch him. Finally, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Father Callahan lifted his head. His eyes were hollow. His hands still gripped the pages, shaking as though burned. And then at last he spoke. Just one line. "They are still singing." The words rippled through the crowd. No one answered. The children wept. The men looked away, and the shaft behind them, sealed and silent, seemed to tremble with every breath of wind. But the priest would not move, and he would not speak again. That night, only hold the pages and listen to the silence. The streets of Raven Hollow lay quiet beneath a gray sky, shutters drawn, doors bolted, smoke rising in thin lines from fewer chimneys. Each day, the town was emptying. It did not happen all at once. Families left in silence, wagons packed at dawn, wheels crunching against the frost. Neighbors pretended not to notice, but they watched from behind curtains, clutching their rosaries. They knew why people were leaving. It wasn't the hunger. It wasn't the cold. It was the sound. At night, when the wind died and the hills were still, the houses seemed to breathe. Timbers creaked, stones shifted, and beneath the floors deep below the earth, there came the faint rhythm of iron against rock, the sound of picks, steady, patient, striking in the dark. Some said it was the mine tunnels, collapsing, the weight of years, stone giving way, but others swore the sound moved. That one night it would come from the hill, and the next from beneath their own beds. And that's when the fear grew. Mothers shook children awake, pressing ears to the floorboards. "Do you hear it?" Some claimed they did. Others lied, saying no, that their eyes betrayed them. The sound spread like a sickness. By the end of the month, nearly half the homes stood abandoned, windows open to the cold, furniture left behind. The village square looked wider now, emptier, as though the town itself had recoiled. But some remained. The stubborn, the devout, the ones who believed prayer could anchor them. They gathered in the church, the last place they trusted. Inside, the candles burned low, the scent of wax mixed with mildew. Father Callahan knelt at the altar, lips moving without pause, voice frayed from days of unbroken prayer. The people filled the pews, heads bowed, eyes fixed on the stone floor beneath their feet, because even there, even in the house of God, they could hear it. Tap, 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 faint but relentless, as though the earth itself were hollow. And that's when the panic set in. One mother clutched her child too tightly. Another man began to shout. Someone swore the stone beneath the altar trembled. The priest raised his hand, begging for calm. His voice cracked against the panic, but the sound only grew. It no longer came from below. It came from the walls, a scraping, a digging, moving upward. The congregation fled into the square, pressing together in the cold. The bell tower rose above them, black against the sky. Its shadow fell long across the stones. The night passed without sleep. By morning, they thought the danger had passed, until the church fell. It began with a crack, sharp, like wood splintering, then another. The ground shook, Birds rose screaming from the rafters, and in a sudden thunderous collapse, the church groaned inward. Stone buckled, the roof fell, the tower swayed, and then it was gone. Dust rolled across the square, swallowing the people in gray. When the air cleared, the church lay in ruin. Only rubble, broken pews, splintered beams, but something wasn't right. From beneath the stone buried in the wreckage came a sound, a ringing, slow, heavy, still ringing. Its tone carried across the hollow streets, echoing through the houses left behind. No one moved toward it. No one dared. The sound rolled on, steady, as though the earth itself had taken the role of bell ringer. Some pressed their hands to their ears, others fell to their knees, and Father Callahan stood frozen, his face pale, his eyes hollow, because he knew a bell only rings when it is struck, and yet no hand touched it. The ringing did not stop until night fell. Even then the silence that followed was worse. Families fled. The next morning, whole homes emptied, dogs left tied in yards, howling until their voices broke. By the end of the week, Raven Hollow was no longer a town.
It was a scattering of stone and timber clinging to a hill, and at the center, its heart torn out, lay the ruin of the church. The bell remained buried, but those who stayed swore they could still feel it, a tremor beneath the earth, a ringing too faint for ears, but heavy enough to shake the soul. And in that silence, faith itself began to crumble, because the one place they trusted had fallen, and no prayer could raise it again. Snow lay in thin patches across the roofs of Raven Hollow. Though no one spoke of winter, the wind carried silence through the streets, not the silence of rest, not the silence of peace. It was the silence of something forced. Days after the collapse, men in dark coats arrived. Their wagons bore no names. Their boots left no sound on the frost. They spoke little, and when they did, it was not to the villagers. They carried papers, seals pressed in wax, and with those the story was written. An accident, an industrial failure, that was all. The mine was sealed, concrete poured thick into the mouth of the shaft. The gray slurry ran over rock and timber, hardening as it cooled. It buried the entrance like a tomb, but the families received no graves, no markers, no stones. The men who vanished were left without names, as though they had never existed. And that was when the unease began, because the villagers had seen the officials near the rubble. They had watched them descend into the ruin of the church, lanterns held low, and when they emerged, they carried boxes, heavy, locked, their lids chained shut. Some swore the boxes dripped. Others said the officials carried nothing at all, but all agreed on one thing: they left before dawn, and the wagons that bore them never returned. The townsfolk asked what was taken, what was hidden. They received no answer. The priest, pale and broken, spoke nothing. His Bible lay open on the altar of a church without walls, the edges of the pages blackened, curling inward. The people looked to him for truth, but he could not lift his eyes. And still the silence pressed heavier. Meetings were held, declarations spoken. The tragedy of Raven Hollow, they said, would be remembered only as an industrial disaster, a failure of safety, a cautionary tale, nothing more. But something wasn't right, because those who lived nearest the mine swore the ground did not rest. On nights when the air was still, the concrete trembled, just enough to rattle the window glass. Children woke crying, convinced they heard voices beneath the floor. Fathers pressed their ears to the ground, only to rise with faces pale. They would not say what they heard. And then there were the dogs. They would not go near the sealed shaft, not even when beaten, not even when dragged. Their bodies stiffened,
Their eyes rolled white, as though they knew, and yet the officials called it finished. They told the town to move on, to forget, but forgetting was impossible when no graves were dug, when no names were spoken. The mothers still gathered at the edge of the hill, standing before the concrete wall, as though it were a gravestone, their hands pressed against its cold surface, their lips moving in prayer, and the prayers carried in whispers, because what else could they do? There were rumors, of course, that something had been brought up from the mine, that it was carried away in the wagons, that the men in black coats did not come to investigate, but to collect, and that was when suspicion turned to fear, because the people of Raven Hollow had seen too much to believe in simple accidents. They had seen the bell buried yet ringing, they had heard the stone groan, as though alive, and they had watched their priest descend into the earth with scripture and return broken, whispering of voices still singing. The silence that followed was not peace, it was warning, and those who remained in Raven Hollow lived with the knowledge that what was sealed away had not ended, it had only been buried, for now, and beneath the concrete, beneath the soil, the sound continued, faint, relentless, the rhythm of iron striking stone, the sound of work still being done. In the dark, where no man returned, under the canopy of Raven Hollow the air felt thick. The forest had swallowed everything. Where rows of cottages once stood, their chimneys smoking against the winter sky, there were only the twisted limbs of oak and ash, pressing inward, leaning as though listening. Stone foundations jutted from the ground like broken teeth. Moss grew over crumbling door frames. What had once been paths, packed hard with the boots of miners, were now no more than deer trails, soft with leaves and mud. The church wall still stood, barely. One arch clung to its stones, ivy pulling at its mortar, the faintest trace of stained glass still clinging like a bruise against the sky. Beneath it a patch of stone remained, smooth, circular, marked by the outline of a baptismal font long taken by time. It was here that most people stopped, because beyond the church, the earth fell away. A depression in the ground, overgrown with ferns and nettles, the edges marked by broken slabs of poured concrete, split and sunken into the mud. This was where the mine had been sealed. The government called it an industrial accident. They came in trucks, laid the concrete thick, and posted warnings that no one should return. The families were given no graves, and so the forest kept the silence. For decades, the valley lay still, but as time passed, people came back. Not the families, not those who remembered, but the young, the restless, the kind of wanderers who searched for places history had forgotten. They found Raven Hollow by accident. Old maps, word of mouth, fragments of stories carried from one town to another, and when they came, they found nothing but trees and stone. At least at first, because it was only when night fell that the forest began to speak. The first to hear it was a hunter. He had camped near the ruins in the late 1950s, setting his fire where the town square once stood. He woke at midnight to a sound he could not place, a low vibration. It seemed to come from beneath the earth, as though the roots themselves were groaning. Then slowly it took form, a rhythm, iron against stone. The sound of picks. The man stayed until dawn, refusing to leave his fire. He told no one of it until years later, when others had heard the same. Because the sound did not remain beneath the soil, it shifted. One moment it came from the ground below his bedroll. The next it rang from the trees beyond the fire. Faint, deliberate, weaving between the trunks like something searching. And then the voices followed, soft at first, a whisper carried on the leaves. Not words, not yet, just a pattern. A rise and fall, steady and deliberate. The hunter thought it was the wind, but the wind does not repeat itself. The wind does not keep cadence. This was different. This was prayer. and that was when the unease began to spread. Others who camped in Raven Hollow told the same, that the forest was alive with a sound no animal made. One man claimed he woke to hear his name, spoken low, whispered just beyond the edge of his fire. He did not stay. He packed in silence and left his tent behind, walking until sunrise, never daring to look back. When he returned home he was pale, his face drawn tight as though hollowed. He told his wife he would never again set foot in a forest. He never did. But the stories did not stop. Through the 60s, 70s, even into the modern day, hikers, students, and explorers came into the valley. Most found nothing but ruins, but some came home changed. They spoke of the air growing heavy around them, pressing against their chests until their breath came shallow. They lit cigarettes to steady their hands, though the smoke seemed to hang too long, unmoving in the stillness. They described hearing the ground exhale. And always, the same sound followed. The picks, the voices, not loud, not sharp, but constant. As though the 11 men who had gone down into the mine had never stopped digging. The legends formed quickly that the miners were still there, that they had been buried alive, condemned to continue their work forever beneath the stone, that their prayers had become part of the rock itself, and when the wind carried just right, their voices seeped upward, rattling the trees, whispering to those who dared to listen. But something wasn't right, because the mine was gone. Sealed, buried, and yet the sound remained. It came not only from below, but from the branches, the leaves, the hollow spaces between roots. The voices were not trapped, they were moving. One student swore he followed the sound of picks for over an hour. Each time he came closer, it shifted further, until he found himself standing in the heart of the forest, no path back, surrounded on all sides by whispers. He returned days later, his shoes ruined, his eyes sunken. He never explained how he found his way out, and that's when the horror of Raven Hollow deepened, because it wasn't just the sound, it was what it left behind. People who stayed too long described dreams of suffocation, of walls closing in, of lungs burning. Some said they woke with mud beneath their nails. Others claimed they tasted iron in their mouths, as though the dust of stone had settled on their tongues, and still the families had no graves. Their fathers, brothers, sons never buried, never found, only the silence of the day and the voices of the night. And for those who came searching, the pattern always ended the same. Curiosity turned to unease, unease turned to suspicion, suspicion to terror, until collapse. Because once you heard the voices, once you felt the iron strike against the stone, you could never be certain it would stop. Some swore it followed them home, that in the stillness of their own rooms, they heard the faintest rhythm in the walls, not loud, not sharp, just enough, a prayer that never ended, a strike that never ceased, and a silence that was never truly empty again. The trees opened slowly, like curtains pulled back, and in the clearing, Raven Hollow waits. No voices, no fires, no people, just silence.
The town that once carried the rhythm of shovels, the smell of smoke, the toll of the bell, now nothing more than the skeleton of itself. Stone walls sag into the grass, roofs cave inward, doors stand crooked, their hinges rusted into immobility. The air is still, as if even the birds have chosen to leave. In the weeds, half buried, lies the church bell. It is rusted through. The once bright bronze turned the color of dried blood, streaked with moss, its mouth choked with nettles and soil. But it is still here, and the silence around it is heavier because of it. Visitors walk past it without speaking. Some pause, staring too long, as though expecting it to ring again. None ever touch it, because those who do, those who press their hands to the earth around it, say they feel it, a vibration, faint but steady, not the pulse of their own blood, not the shiver of their own nerves, but something deeper, something that belongs to the ground, and that's when the unease begins. It does not happen during the day. In the day, Raven Hollow is only ruin, a place for photographs, for silence, for weeds pushing through brick. It is at night, when the fear returns, when the moonlight sharpens the edges of stone, and the paths vanish into shadow, that is when the stillness feels alive. Those who have camped here speak of it first as a pressure, a weight that gathers in the chest. Breathing grows shallow. The silence is no longer absence, but presence, and then they feel it, the earth shifting, not shaking, not quaking, just moving, as though something beneath is turning slowly, deliberately, pressing upward. It begins in the hands, a faint hum against the fingertips, if they rest too close to the ground, then in the feet, then in the skull, until the silence itself seems to vibrate. But something wasn't right, because the movement had no source, no cause, no machinery, no wind, only stone, and stone should not move. One visitor, a photographer, came in the late 1990s. He had heard the legends and wanted only to capture the stillness of the ruins. But when he stood in the center of the hollow, camera in hand, he felt it, a low tremor, not in the ground beneath his boots, but in the air, like a resonance, traveling through him, humming in the bones of his teeth. He dropped the camera. He never returned. Others speak of similar things. One woman knelt in the weeds to clear away dirt from a broken stone. She said her palms filled with a faint vibration, steady as breath. Another man pressed his ear to the soil, joking he wanted to hear the miners singing. He pulled away pale, his lips thin. He said nothing during the drive home, but weeks later, he told his brother that he had heard prayers, not in words he understood, but in rhythm. He swore it was still in his head, repeating, soft as breath, and then he stopped speaking of it altogether. The silence has never ended. It waits in the soil, in the bell, in the broken stones of the church. It waits in the hollow, where the mine was sealed, beneath layers of concrete, now split with roots and moss. It waits in the branches overhead, where no bird will rest. Raven Hollow is not just a ghost town, it is a wound, a place where time has not healed, only closed over, leaving what lies beneath untouched. And those who step into it feel the weight of what is still moving below, because silence is never empty. Silence remembers, silence carries, and here, in the heart of Raven Hollow, it endures. Even now, even tonight, we bury men in the earth to take from it, but sometimes, the earth buries us instead. Raven Hollow stands as a reminder, not all prayers are heard, and some never stop.